Good afternoon. Welcome to our fourth and final panel on lessons of the last 50 years. I am thrilled to be able to moderate this discussion today with four people who have been big participants in the success of the Clean Air Act over the last half century. And we're going to talk about their experiences and what they draw from that and where we go from here. So I'm going to introduce our four panelists first, and then we'll have an opening question. Tom Jorling was present at the creation of the Clean Air Act. He was one of the principal staff directors of the 1970 law, working with Leon Billings. They were from different parties, working from senators from different parties, but got this act written and enacted. Tom also was an assistant administrator at EPA in the 1970s and was the commissioner for the Department of Environmental Conservation in New York State in the late 1980s and early 1990s. So I'm just going to give you some relevant points from the background of our panelists. The full biographies, of course, are available. William K. Reilly was the EPA administrator from 1989 to 1993, appointed by President George H.W. Bush. He also has been president of World Wildlife Fund, was co-chair of President Obama's Deepwater Horizon Oil Spill Commission. Bill Reilly is a good friend, a great friend of American University and the School of Public Affairs. We have the Reilly Environmental Leadership Awards, the Reilly Scholarships, and in recognition of all of that, Bill was granted an honorary Doctor of Public Service degree in 2015 by university. Also with us today, Carol Browner. Carol is the longest serving EPA administrator, 1993 to 2001, appointed by President Bill Clinton. Carol also previously had been the Secretary of Environmental Regulation in Florida, and then worked in President Obama's White House Office of Energy and Climate Change Policy, and was a principal advisor to the president. And Gina McCarthy was the EPA administrator from 2013 to 2017, appointed, of course, by President Obama. Previously, Gina had been the assistant administrator for air, so many years of experience with the Clean Air Act, and also had been the Connecticut Commissioner for the Department of Environmental Protection. Gina now is president and CEO of the Natural Resources Defense Council. So I asked, instead of opening presentations, I asked everybody to think about what they drew on in their experience as they reflect on the success of the Clean Air Act. What is it about their experience? And Tom, of course, was there for the drafting of the original law. Bill Reilly became administrator as the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 were developing on the Hill, and then responsible for early implementation. Carol Browner involved also with the 19 Clean Air Act amendments and implementation, involved in efforts to tighten standards for fine particulates, ozone, dealt with a number of clean air issues. So I thought we'll do this chronologically, Tom. You were there at the beginning. What do you think were the sort of the key design features of the Clean Air that made it successful?
Well, thank you, Dan, and thanks for the Lung Association for hosting this. I might add at the outset that somewhat incongruently, the celebration has refueled my sense of sadness and loss that I experienced 4 years ago with the passing of my colleague and close friend, Leon Billings. He would have very much enjoyed this celebration and would have brought his very acute sense of how to move forward to it. So I start with that recognition. Going back now 50 years to look at the 1970 Clean Air Act and its legacy, it's it prompts one to think back to the real actors that brought it about. The Subcommittee on Air and Water Pollution was comprised of 7 members, 9 members by the time it was enacted, but 9 members who thought of themselves first and foremost as legislators and not as many of their successors now feel as celebrities. So they spent considerable time working an issue. For instance, as the committee embarked on its campaign or on its work that led to the 70 amendments, it conducted 15 days of oversight hearings and 15 days of legislative hearings. And the consequence of those hearings was to examine the failures of earlier federal legislation in addressing air pollution and what was the cause of those failures. But they also expressed a deep frustration that air pollution was continuing to grow as a problem, and that the Congress had not provided either the objective or the tools to actually meet the promise of trying to clean the air. So it was a period of intense activity surrounded by a culture and climate in which there was considerable turmoil. For instance, Senator Baker said in describing the activity, the committee members actually enjoyed working on a tough domestic issue like clean air because they were besieged with constituent activists in opposition to the Vietnam War, which at that time was at its height during the era, and during that era, with the Senate office building in effect occupied by demonstrators. They could not leave an executive session. And as soon as they did, they were besieged by these protesters that followed them wherever they went until they were able to find another similar respite from that protest. So they had that sort of constantly in the background. And part of that was that they recognized that the American people needed something. They needed to demonstrate to the American people that they could accomplish a public policy objective. And it was a motivating factor behind the work that they did. But I think the process then, in technical terms, hasn't changed. Political scientists still describe the legislative process the same way, but it is not executed the same way as it was then. And I think a large measure of the product of the Clean Air Act is the fact that these members actually enjoyed working on the subject, but they were determined to make changes that were going to produce results. And we can go into some of those changes as we go along, but I think it's important to recognize that this is the product of 9 people primarily. There were others involved and some in the House, but 9 members who devoted considerable time to the issue. They became expert at the issue, and the product, because of its durability and sustainability and the accomplishments that it has achieved, is a reflection of that hard work.
Okay, thank you. And we're going to go chronologically to get the flow of history here. So, Bill, you took office in 1989. Very involved in the passage of the Clean Air Act amendments and the early implementation. What lessons would you draw in thinking about the success of the Clean Air Act?
Well, Tom has described a situation that was an achievement of bipartisan collaboration. And the same was true of the amendments of 1990. We had a summer of the election campaign that was very sensitized to the environment, to upper atmospheric ozone, scientific paying attention to environmental pollution problems, to wash up of needles and other waste on the shores of Long Island and elsewhere. And so it caused the President, then campaigner George H.W. Bush, to promise a new Clean Air Act to address an issue that had not been addressed, despite the efforts of Senator Mitchell and some others, since the late 1970s. When I took office, I remember asking President-elect Bush if he was going to keep his word and have a three-part Clean Air Act, and I listed the three parts, and he smiled and said, yes, I promised that, and I will do that. The country was with him on that. I think it may well have taken a conservative or a Republican president to get the kind of commanding numbers that he got in the House and the Senate to pass that law. I remember one of the most interesting parts of it, looking back, was the fierce determination on the part of the chief sponsor of the bill, who actually did not support it and told me he thought it was a very bad bill, John Dingell in the House, chairman of the Commerce Committee. When he got inserted into the legislative history, a provision that said under no circumstances was anything in the law intended to empower EPA to regulate carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases. Well, thanks to Justice Scalia, who persuaded the court to ignore legislative histories and to concentrate on the text, on the language of a statute, that was not material in Massachusetts v. EPA, which determined that the Clean Air Act could be used to regulate carbon dioxide if it was in fact endangering the public health and environment of people of the United States. I look back on that history and think that we had a very compelling political reason to take the Clean Air Act and their amendments seriously. And we had someone who exploited that public emotion, that public feeling. I don't think we have the same degree of groundswell. Some polling was done some years ago that indicated that the Clean Air Act is just as popular as it has ever been in terms of public support. And something like 4/5 of the public wants to maintain it or even strengthen it. But whether they really would vote it or vote a climate kind of initiative is much less in doubt in the minds of a lot of pollsters. I think that it's hard for me to, frankly, to look back on the huge success, and it's probably the most successful public health initiative that we've seen coming from the government virtually in our history as a country, as was mentioned by someone earlier in the program, without feeling the present reality. The air quality index where I am today is 106. It was 156 yesterday. In the middle of the night, 3 a.m. night before last, we got the alert to be prepared for evacuation from where we are. The air pollution in Petaluma this morning, which is a half hour south of here, was over 400. This is a current reality. We are not going to have consistently clean air during the fire season in Northern California, on into the future, it would appear. I look at the present situation and try to see opportunities in it. And one of the most important ones is that as we begin to come out of the COVID virus, I think we have an opportunity to remake our cities to some degree, to convert possibly office space to housing, which is in such scarce supply in California and elsewhere, particularly if, as seems likely, a lot of companies are going to continue the work at home priority. I think that we could green our cities to some degree, green space, better plans for managing the automobile, better support for public transportation. I hope we don't fail to take advantage of that opportunity. And I hope we can also find a way to appeal to both parties, most likely with some kind of infrastructure climate amalgam that is really compelling and sustainable. Going forward, I think we've got to think that way and hope that will be possible, and hope that there are enough members of the Republican Party who have coastal jurisdictions who will be more sensitive to infrastructure needs than perhaps they otherwise would be or have been. But I think we have opportunities to build on one very important element of the success of the Clean Air Act, and that is its popularity and the public trust in it. I had a conversation with someone who has raised a good bit of money for President Trump and his campaign and asked whether the Clean Air Act was safe, to which the answer was the statutes are safe. They're not going to be affected. Well, it doesn't say anything about regulations, and we're all familiar with how that's worked. But that, I think, does suggest a platform of success. And the job, I think, for those of us who want to take this further is one of consistent and emphatic communication. Communication about the success of the environmental enterprise in the last 50 years and the opportunities and the needs, scientifically based, to take them further.
Thank you, Bill. Yeah, infrastructure has come up a couple of times today. We all thought that would be an area where there could be multiple wins, but you never really saw much. So Carol, you were an EPA administrator. I mean, a lot of us can sort of look back to the 1990s when just at a broad level, a lot of the bipartisanship in our political system started to break down, but you still moved the Clean Air Act forward in many respects. What would you draw as the principal lessons of your experience?
Well, thank you. And I want to also thank Paul Billings and the American Lung Association for bringing us together today. And I want to thank Bill and Tom for the roles you played in creating the template upon which Gina and I were later, and others, Lisa Jackson, able to do our work. You know, I was thinking as I think Tom, or I guess Bill was talking, I was a young staffer working for then Senator Al Gore during the 1990 debates. And Al had this brilliant idea to offer 6 amendments, except he called them 6 strengthening amendments. And you might imagine George Mitchell didn't find that all that attractive. But at the end of the day, we were successful in having many of them, important ones, adopted. And I want to give a shout out to an environmentalist who really helped us in that, which is Blake Early. He's no longer with us, but a great man who had the foresight to think about provisions that would make a lot of sense in the Clean Air Act of 1990, provisions which I then got to implement. You know, I think that what is so important about the 1990 law and the 1970, because many provisions are picked up, they're just carried forward, is the flexibility. It recognized that science evolves, that things will change. You know, for my tenure, perhaps one of the most important decisions I made was to set the first ever fine particle standard. I think, Gina, you tightened it to strengthen the ozone standard, and then to litigate that all the way to the Supreme Court, where we won 9-0, where the court basically said, it is a public health standard. She's right to have set it based on the best available science. Scalia wrote the majority opinion. He went on to say, but maybe Congress should make it a cost benefit provision, but it's not yet. And so therefore upholding, you know, the work that we had done, and the scientists and others at EPA had done, just an amazing, amazing group of people. But I agree that the narrative of the Clean Air Act is really a health narrative. Very early in my tenure at EPA, so 1993, I met with a group of environmentalists, and I had given a speech a few weeks earlier talking about EPA as a health agency, not just an environmental agency. And I remember one of the environmentalists saying to me, how dare you? You're an environmental agency. And I said, they're kind of related. And I think today we all know just how important that relationship is. I was also working for President Clinton, who had run on the platform that we didn't have to choose between a healthy environment and a healthy economy, that in fact we could have both. And I think many people have said, you know, the Clinton years, the 8 years that I served at EPA, were some of the most aggressive in terms of ensuring public health protections. And at the same time, the economy was growing. We did that in with some dark clouds, the Gingrich era, the contract with America. If you go back and read it, you will see it is really aimed at the regulatory agencies. There was an effort, EPA was shut down 3 times by the Gingrich leadership. There was 16 different limitations on my statutory authority as administrator. We were successful in getting all of those removed, and we were successful because we told the story of EPA, why you want an environmental cop on the beat, why you want science. I remember a member of Congress saying to me, well, Ms. Browner, you're just free to do anything. And I said, no, There is the law and there is the science, and that is the box within which I operate. It is a very, very well defined box. I think as I look forward and I think about what we have left to do, and it will be a constant piece of work. There is not a day when we will, claim victory and the air is perfect. One is the issue of environmental justice, and how do we really provide protections in those communities where there is a cumulative impact that is in excess of what we know to be safe. Each facility may have its permit, but when you add them all up together, there's really just too much. And so this whole issue of environmental justice, and obviously, and the work in Gina and Lisa started it, of climate, and how do we use, if we're not able to get new laws, how do we use the existing law? And I'll just finish with a kind of funny story. I think many of you remember Tom DeLay. He was Gingrich's whip. If you actually went to see him in his office, he sat on one side of the table, you on the other side, and there was a whip on the table, an actual whip. He was not a fan of EPA. He was not a fan of mine. And one day in a congressional hearing, he and I got into a fight back and forth in an open room. And the fight was basically, Ms. Browner, you're regulating carbon. No, I'm not. Ms. Browner, you're regulating carbon, back and forth. And finally I said, I'm not even sure the Clean Air Act allows us to regulate carbon. We are studying it. We're doing the science that we should be doing, but I'm not sure. And he said, well, why don't you go figure it out? Why don't you write me a memo? So I went back to John Cannon, the then general counsel, and I said, John, what do you think? And, being a lawyer, they took their time, but eventually they produced the Cannon memo, which said, yes, if you make a determination that it endangers public health and welfare, you must regulate it. We updated that memo under Gary Guzzi before we left office at the end of the Clinton administration. The state of Massachusetts took the memo and found its way to the Supreme Court. And Bill just mentioned the Mass versus EPA decision, and it actually footnotes the Cannon Guzzi memo. And so I dare say that Tom DeLay has no clue that he is the proximate cause of why EPA set out to regulate greenhouse gases. But, it's a great law. I actually think that and the Clean Water Act are amazing. Clean Water Act, we're not here to talk about that today, but it's been on the books forever and it hasn't been updated or modernized. And yet it continues to produce real results in terms of driving down water pollution, in terms of stormwater pollution. And I think similarly, the Clean Air Act, if need be, will serve us well. Hopefully we can get climate legislation, but if we don't, I think we have a tool, and Gina has already seen that course, that will take us forward. And I think that's essential.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, maybe one of us should send an email to Tom DeLay on how he shaped.
The last time I saw him, he was being kicked off of Dancing with the Stars.
Gina, you worked on clean air at the national level for 8 years, and in Connecticut before that. And part of your tenure was that climate now sort of came up on the agenda, and as a result of the Massachusetts case, EPA had arguable authority to deal with it. Could you talk a little bit about what lessons you learned, and maybe with reference also to the climate issue?
Well, first of all, Dan, let me just begin by thanking you for going in chronological order, because it means I can have the last word among the EPA administrators, which is always a good thing. I also want to thank Carol for her leadership, because frankly, Carol worked very hard in the White House during the Obama administration to get the attention that climate deserved. It paved the way in the second term for us to make progress. I want to recognize my good friend Bill Reilly, and I also want to recognize obviously Tom for all of his work, but I also want to make sure that I give a shout out not just to ALA and to Paul and to Leon, God bless them, but also to Bill Ruckelshaus, who I think every one of us owes such a tremendous debt of gratitude in so many ways for his courage and his leadership. I don't think I've met a more decent, kind, and thoughtful human being in my whole life. And so I love him dearly, and I think we all miss him. But let me also give a shout out to Christy Todd Whitman and Lee Thomas, who have basically testified in front of Congress with Bill and I about how we need to keep moving forward at EPA and to keep pushing even during this administration to do the right thing. I think they're terrific because of that. And also my good friend Lisa Jackson, who gave me the opportunity to work on the Clean Air Act. And it was an exciting venture, honestly, on to try to do, as Carol indicated, to use the Clean Air Act appropriately to actually engage on the issue of climate change, which I think all of us saw as the epitome of the health challenge that EPA had to address. Because Carol's right, we're really talking about health. And when you're talking about climate, you're not talking about the health of the planet. You're talking about the health of the people who want to live on it. And so it became an overriding consideration by the second term of the Obama administration. And I was grateful to have spent 4 years basically learning from the career staff at EPA on how the Clean Air Act worked or didn't, or was confined or wasn't, and what all the legal machinations had been before, and to also have some of the most brilliant people like Janet McCabe and Joe Goffman to actually advise me and others on how to move all these issues forward. And I think, as you know, we actually began by really moving forward in the car world, which Carol also started by regulating automobiles. But my first big experience was the delivery of the endangerment finding. Now, if you ever want to spend the rest of your life trying to stay awake reading something that will take you at least 2 years to read cover to cover, it is the first endangerment finding, because it is so filled with the most dense science, because EPA is at its heart a science agency. We do not shoot by the hip. We gather science, we gather data, we analyze it appropriately, and we take action commensurate with the law. And so it was an amazing kind of way of getting introduced to the complexity of this issue for me, as well as the ways in which EPA just has to constantly dot its I's and cross its T's, unlike any other federal agency. I mean, you had to jump through hoops. In the middle of the endangerment finding, we had ClimateGate happen. And we went back and reanalyzed everything, taking out any of the work of the scientists that were under question during that, and redid the entire analytics around this. And it made me realize not just how difficult it was going to be to regulate climate, but also just the difficult challenge that EPA had obviously been facing throughout its, by then, 44 years or so history. It was an amazing thing. And I really think it tells you the reason why we had to act with such clarity on science, the reason why we have to act so thoughtfully with the career staff about what the legal history is. What kind of arguments can you make? How do we respond to each of those comments? Much of which is not even considered during this administration, right? We had to do it because the Clean Air Act is special. It is special because it works. It actually continues to push the envelope. When I went into EPA, I cannot tell you the number of mandatory lawsuits already before me that had already been defined a strategy, a timeline for us to come to final conclusion on, or when they were lined up for us to make those determinations. And it was amazing workload when I got there. But the best part about EPA was that we knew that everything we were being mandated to do was right. That the science had progressed and the law told us we had to look at it. And while we didn't have the resources to look at everything, we carefully looked at how you align your decisions in a way that can inform decision-making moving forward. So we looked at all those and we carefully lined them up because we wanted to make sure that before you look at reducing greenhouse gases from the power sector, you looked at the mercury and air toxic standard. So why wouldn't we want to make them as clean as possible before you start looking at then what is the burden to address climate change, which will in fact be a lot lower because you will be dealing with fewer utilities that wanted to meet the upgrades associated with MATS. This is the brilliance of the career staff and the political people at EPA who understood that the Clean Air Act was not for the faint of heart. And I have to say, Tom, leaving my last word to you, is I have never heard a story of anyone saying that working on the Clean Air Act was a respite. So you really won the prize there, because I don't think I slept for 8 years. And I loved every minute of it. And I really would hope that any administration coming forward would give it the respect it deserves, will restore science to EPA, would follow the law and not look for outcomes, and do the right thing, because 50 years of history at EPA has not ever been an easy, does not show an easy path, and it shows disagreements, but it does show a tremendous amount of respect for the career staff who made it what it is, for the scientists who never failed to tell us the truth, whether we liked it or not, and all of the folks that came before me who so elegantly led the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to be the absolute best federal agency on health and natural resources anywhere in the world.
Thank you, Gina. Some great words about EPA, and certainly the science issue and scientific integrity is a big issue, and that's an area where a restoration of EPA's commitments and capabilities needs to occur. And the people are there. I think you're right. It's just a matter of using it effectively. So there are two other topics I wanted to get to before we hear from the audience. One was the states. Three of the four of you were state commissioners or directors, and obviously Bill dealt a lot with states. And then just inequities in the environmental justice issue. And we've heard a lot today about what we know from monitoring data and disparate impacts of pollution and so on. So just start a few minutes on states. Tom, the 1970 law, I mean, one thing it certainly did was it sort of said, okay, states, you're no longer in charge of a lot of these big issues on clean air. You have an important role, but the federal government is moving into it. Could you talk a bit about what the thinking and sort of the intention behind the federal-state relationship that was reflected in the Clean Air Act?
The basic model was very much a product of Senator Muskie's orientation. At the same time he was chairman of the Air and Water Pollution Subcommittee, he was also chairman of the Intergovernmental Relations Committee. And having been a governor, so he was of the view that the states had a very serious and important role to play, and that certainly became a part of the structure and function of the Clean Air Act. With respect to the role of the states, I think when I became a state administrator, after having been a federal administrator, I basically said, well, we can get rid of the federal government as long as they just give us the big state grants. There is a tense relationship that exists, but it's also a productive relationship that exists. As far as what I learned becoming a state administrator after having worked at EPA and worked on the Hill was the Clean Air Act gave clear march orders to what the states had to accomplish. And it gave tools. So for the first time, the states became very serious about conducting inventories of emission sources within their quality control regions. And when that inventory is taken, it sort of feeds back as to what more is necessary. For instance, in the New York metropolitan area, in order to meet the ambient air quality standards, and looking at our inventory, the only way we could do it is if we could get tools over the automobile. And Congress responded with that in 1990 to allow other states, I believe it's now up to 13, to adopt the California auto emission program. And because of the discipline of that process, when I would go to the state legislators and say, well, if we don't adopt the California emission standards, here's what we have to control in the city of New York. And those were very draconian measures. So it sort of fed into a system which made the whole thing work successfully. The whole business of the non-deterioration requirements that are established now in the location of a new source in a non-attainment area. All of those tools forced the states to grow very significantly professionally. And I think that has been a large part of the success of the Clean Air Act. It's not just a federal accomplishment. The states have had an important role. And of course, we all took lessons beginning when I worked on the staff from the state of California. They, both in the air and water cases, the state of California had developed a kind of professionalism with the scientific research background produced from their great universities that all contributed to the success. And so when I got to New York State and I realized that the professional staff at DEC, as it was called, or is called, was equal to the professional staff of EPA. And I think I share the views what Carol has expressed about the importance, and Gina has expressed about the importance of the professional staff. But certainly I found that same quality in the state of New York. Just one anecdote, there was a fellow named Dr. Rao, who was an air pollution scientist, and he had produced a card for me, and this is important, Bill, to you. He had speciated all of the emissions from all of the coal-fired power plants in the Ohio and Mississippi valleys. And he could tell which of those plants was depositing acid rain on the Adirondacks. And so when I went home to Cincinnati, I would say that Big Alice up the river here is contributing this much acid rain to the state of New York. So it was an eye-opener for me to see the quality of the state. And I would also add, you know, I think the three administrators here would concur in this. The states weren't all the same. There are some good states and there's some not so good states. But the good states also had the toughest local or state environmental regulatory regimes. And those states, like California, like New York, like Florida, were the most dynamic economic states in the country, further indicating the compatibility of environmental protection with economic success.
Gina and Carol, as former, well, you've worked from the state level, you've led, of course, the National Environmental Agency. My sense is that, I mean, some states are real leaders, some states not so much. It seems like we're getting more divergence. Is that, where do you think we are? How is the EPA-state relationship working these days?
I think the law was clever in recognizing that there was a role for states and that was an important sort of sharing. You know, pollution doesn't recognize political boundaries. So EPA would be looking at the pollution that moves. They'd be looking at the big sectors, the cars, the trucks. You know, California would have its authority. I remember being on the floor in the 1990 debate when Pete Wilson was defending California's right to keep its stronger and separate authorities. Not everyone was agreeing with him, but he was successful, and I think that's important. But this idea that you would have this delegation of authority, that EPA would come in, look at a state, determine whether or not, there's the reason we do this right now in Gina's lap, come in, take a look at whether the state had the actual capabilities, and then grant delegation. And then states would handle the permitting, the sort of the day-to-day operation. And for example, when I was in Florida, we could charge a permitting fee. It's important to remember that EPA cannot charge a permitting fee. And so if you're actually going to sort of recoup some of the costs, having the states use their authorities, I think was important. But equally important is allowing EPA, federal EPA, to step back in if a state is not doing its job. And the real vehicle for that is to overfile in an enforcement case. We only did it, that I'm aware of, at my level, a handful of times when I was at EPA. It was not without controversy, but it is an important tool that sort of keeps everyone on their toes. The other thing we did, Bill, you may have done this, I don't know, but I know we did a fair amount of this, is we recognized that the law recognized, and we honored what the law recognized, which is the government to government relationship between the federal government and the tribes. And we started delegating authorities to tribes. This is also true of the Clean Water Act. We probably did more in the Clean Water Act than we did under the Clean Air Act. I once had a governor, a Western governor, say to me I was going to create a war if I wasn't careful. But the law was very clear about their authority, and we thought it was important to honor that. But I think it's these balances that are struck inside of the Clean Air Act, where you ask states to do certain things on a day-to-day basis if they can meet the criteria set forth by EPA in terms of having the staffing, having the authorities, they have to pass state laws, having the finances. And then you have this overfile that allows the federal EPA to come back in. I don't know, you all may know, I don't know of any instance under any of the laws that have state delegation where EPA has actually taken back a delegation. I think it's hard to do, but I think it is, you have other ways of holding a state accountable. I think every single state, now Gina, you may know the answer to this, has been delegated Title V permitting under the Clean Air Act. I know under the Safe Drinking Water Act, there's one state that never sought delegation for day-to-day management, and that is Wyoming. So all of us in the federal family pay for that. But I think everybody has now received delegation, at least a part of the Title V permitting. I think it's good. You have just different strengths, and you bring them to bear.
I guess, Dan, let me add to Carol's remarks by saying that, I think we worked really hard to establish better relationships between the states and EPA. There's always going to be a healthy tension. You can't get around that. But we did try to do a lot of work with the regions to provide consistency, but also to recognize that each region sort of has its own persona that really reflects the persona of the states in those regions. So it was always a delicate balance, and God love Janet McCabe for being the most patient human being in the world, because I think her work and others allowed us to establish a much better relationship with ECOS and to work through that as a good venue. But the other point I'd really want to make here, and it dovetails with what Carol said, it's really important that states have their own authorities. And that we figure out how to marry what the states and the federal government are doing, because there are times when states change and you have to take over and apply more pressure at the federal level so that their enforcement and compliance doesn't wane. But you also benefit hugely, like in times like now, when the federal government isn't actively regulating, especially in issues like climate change. We benefited enormously from the activities of the state. And one of the reasons why I decided to go to NRDC, call me crazy, I know you're all calling me crazy, is because it's a great place, but it really works at different levels of government, because if you actually want to get over the hump that we're in now, you have to rely on states to continue to act in the absence of federal leadership. And so what we're seeing in clean energy is clearly a reflection, not of oh Lord, we don't have a clean power plan anymore, but it's a reflection that the market listened when the federal government spoke, and the states have held them accountable to continue to move forward, and the same with local government. So I'm this huge believer, probably because I lived during the first Earth Day, I'm a real believer that this is a democratic process, that it's not all about what you do or say at the federal level, but it is about doing everything you can at every level and laddering that up to really strong basis for action. Had we not moved forward with Reggie and moved forward with cap and trade in California, we would not have been able to understand the complexities of those systems enough to be able to utilize them effectively at the federal level. And my hope is build on those strategies moving forward. So
You know, one of, I think
it's like it's
very well. Gina, I was just gonna say, one of my favorite lines when I was a state director and I'd get hauled up before the state legislature about why we were going to impose, tailpipe emission inspections was the EPA made me do it. And, when I got to EPA, I thought, ooh, that was a bad answer. How do we really join together and ECOS and the work that Gina did at ECOS, I think was important, but it is a common answer that state directors use, which is the big bad EPA is making them do something.
Yeah. Dan, could I add a point here? Yeah. I think you've heard from people who actually function at the state level and understand it probably better than I do. But my own experience as administrator was I much more often got pressure to lighten up, to be lenient, not to administer aggressively from the states. And for most of them, they aren't all California. And I think that there was an underlying philosophy that wasn't articulated maybe so specifically, but we had to have federal legislation because there was a strong concern that in the absence of it, competition for economic growth, susceptibility to local industries, and just general lack of the kind of experience and initiative to take regulatory action at the state level made that essential. So it has been a partnership, but it's not always been an easy one, and probably it functions most productively when people like Carol can say in Florida, it's not my idea, the EPA is making me do it, and that functions pretty well probably.
Yeah, I think anybody from EPA has heard that argument. Just, give us the hammer and give us some money, and we can take it from there. I wanted to just touch on, before taking a couple of audience questions, it's come up several times today, just the inequities in air pollution and exposures to different kinds of harmful emissions. And Bill, as I recall, you were the administrator when environmental justice became a big deal, when it really, the issue emerged and got a lot of attention. So I just a couple of thoughts on how do we try and deal with those kinds of inequities, because we're recognizing that's a big issue.
Well, it's been very helpful, I think, in the past couple of years to get more focus on the issue, to have scientific information, to have monitoring that shows that they're not imagining things when they say that they're getting a different quality, both of regulation and of air pollution in many jurisdictions. And it's established. So it's incumbent now to deal with it. There is the Office of, I think, Environmental Justice, I guess it's called now, at EPA. It seems to me that the time has come to link the enforcement enterprise and priority very much with the environmental justice priority, and to begin to take some actions where you can in those areas. That's a product of information. I think the more that we communicate the sense that, look, nobody's asking for special favors here. They're not getting the benefit of the equal protection of the laws, and that's what they should have. I think that is more likely to win public support for giving this a priority and paying a lot more attention to it. It's not altogether an easy problem. In some places, you will find that centers of employment for those very people are, in fact, the sources of the problem from the point of view of pollution. So a certain amount of it has to be, I think, sensitive to the combination of economic interest and environmental protection. But there's no question that now we know the health effects of differential pollution, that this is a priority. It's no longer something that we need to consider. It's something we need to effect.
Okay.
And can I just add, Like many of you, I was watching the CNN special on John Lewis, the congressman, the great civil rights leader. And the very last photo in the documentary on CNN is a photo of President Clinton signing the executive order, the first ever executive order on environmental justice. And I'm in the photo, Lewis, other people are in the photo. And at first I was like, oh, wow, that's so great, you know, that this is being recognized. And then I thought, oh my God, we haven't done enough. We haven't even come close to doing enough. So with all of that effort to bring the federal government together, we have still come up really just completely short. And for all the reasons that Bill and others have said, it is very complicated. But you know what? That's a bit of an excuse too. We just need to say, it's a reality. We have the facts. I can't keep saying it's complicated. We got to get on with solving it. And Bill, you mentioned, I think that the path forward, which is equal protection under the law, that these communities are absolutely committed to equal protection under the law. And whether that means we did, when I was at EPA, we had some meetings with the Justice Department, with the Civil Rights Division, trying to understand, could we bring that to bear? And, you know, hopefully that's a tool. There may be other tools. But this is something where it is, from my personal perspective, it is simply inexcusable and it has to be fixed. And we can try and get laws to fix it, but we better not count on them. We better figure out how to thread our way through the existing laws, the existing structures to make things happen.
You know, an example I would cite, and one that has concerned me a lot, and I've mentioned it before on an AU program, is the Navajo Reservation. In fact, in terms of pollution, in terms rather of COVID, the top 5, if they were states, reservations, would be ahead of New York and California in terms of numbers relative to their populations. The directive that people in the Navajo Reservation should spend more time washing their hands notably ignores that 50% of the households don't have running water. Now, that kind of thing it was shocking to me when I saw it. And it's not uncommon for the reservations in various parts of the country, but it shows what a huge unmet, unrecognized problem this is.
Dan, can I add just one thing? Actually, 2 things. One is that obviously Carol and Bill are right. I thought it was just amazing that headlines were made when the data showed that Black Americans die at twice the rate of their white counterparts when they're exposed to COVID-19. Now, I'm not suggesting it shouldn't have been a headline, but it was never going to be a surprise to any of us. This is how it's going. And with climate, they are going to continue to be in the crosshairs first and foremost. And it's time to stop, talking about this like it's something that we can't manage when we can. Because these are the frontline and fence line communities, and they are the people most at risk of dying from pollution exposure throughout the world, just because they're poor, they're Black, they're brown, they're indigenous communities that start off with inherently worse health challenges to begin with, not because they don't want to be healthy, but they don't have access to healthcare facilities, they don't have access to healthy food, they live in degraded housing with lead paint, they don't have access to clean air and clean water. These are the communities that need it and desperately. And the challenge is for us to stop being afraid of addressing that and start recognizing that the science exists and we have to do it. And I would point out that Catherine McCabe, who was one of our terrific career staff at US EPA, when I was there and for many years before that, is the commissioner of the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. And she has recently worked and been successful in working with environmental justice communities and her governor to actually pass the first, I think, statewide level environmental justice bill that is comprehensive enough to make a really big difference. Is it perfect? No. But I want to congratulate her and point people to that, because it is something that will not only think about after effects, but fundamentally build the issue of cumulative impact into permitting decisions. That's the gold standard. That's the big deal thing. So it's exciting. We are at a moment when demand is actually pouring down on us to actually address the issues of systemic racism. Why wouldn't we build that into every ounce of our strategy moving forward to lead to a cleaner and healthier and more just future? It's demanded. Go for it.
You know, Dan, I
Sure.
know we're almost out of time, but Gina had mentioned Bill Ruckelshaus, the first administrator and then a subsequent administrator of EPA. And I think if we go back to the beginning of EPA, the thing that I'm the most struck by is the moral and ethical commitment we made as a country to protect our air and our water. You think about the Clean Water Act. It didn't say protect it this much. It said fishable and swimmable.
Mm-hmm.
You think about the NAAQS provision of the clean air, protect the public's health. And I hope that as we move forward, we can always be mindful of it, in some ways recapture that moral and ethical commitment, because it is really, really kind of basic, and particularly when you think about environmental justice and what is happening, as Gina said, in these communities, and when you think about climate change. I mean, think about the arc of EPA, which always sit above it is this moral and ethical commitment to a better, cleaner future for every person in the country. And sometimes we lose track of that, and we need to be mindful of it.
Yeah. It's not just, it's that, I was going to talk in the conclusion of this sense of common purpose and this commitment to achieving big things. And Ann Carlson talked in the previous panel about thinking big and thinking about accomplishing big things.
Yeah, may I just say a word?
Go ahead, Bill.
I haven't heard it. I've been tuned in most of the day, but I did not hear this mentioned. But there is a proposal that I have drawn attention to before for a $40 gasoline tax or carbon tax that has gained a lot of favor in certain communities. Former Secretary Jim Baker, Henry Paulson, George Shultz. And what this would do would start with a $40 tax, and it would incrementally rise year upon year. And there's nothing wrong with that, except I think it's a little too small. But what it also would do, and I don't want to encourage this thinking. We've often said that the Clean Air Act was not designed to manage climate. It could be better designed if it were specifically to address as a criteria pollutant, for example, CO2. It doesn't do that, but it's the instrument we have. It's a very powerful one. And there are really two institutions in this country that have paid a lot of attention to climate, or any attention to climate. One is EPA, the other is the courts. And this particular bill would remove both of them from any consideration or regulation of greenhouse gases. And I really think it's a pernicious bill. But it has gotten some support. It's gotten some conservative support. And I certainly understand why the oil industry would favor it, because it does immunize them against any further lawsuits or responsibilities. But I think it's important to defend the Clean Air Act in this conversation as the most appropriate and effective instrument with genuine power that we have to address climate.
Excellent. Well, we're just about time. There were a few questions from the audience, but it was just too much fun and too enlightening just to ask questions directly.
We all talk too much.
No. Any final 30-second thoughts that anybody'd like to? I mean, maybe we just quickly. What do you think is going to be really important as we look ahead the next couple of decades, Tom?
I think the lesson I would say is that administrations make a difference and administrators make a difference, as pointed out by the three that are represented here. And I think that message has to resonate through the society as we approach November.
Okay, Carol?
As we look forward, climate, it is like nothing we have ever had to deal with. And I would say climate justice, that as we look at what we will do, as we look at these communities that are most impacted, to be ever mindful of climate justice. You know, when I was at EPA, we started setting standards based on sort of the most at risk children, pregnant women, because by doing that, we were protecting all. if we think about climate justice communities in every decision we make, by protecting them, we will probably be protecting all.
Okay, thank you. Gina, any final thought?
Final thought is that I think that the most important thing for us is to recognize that we have to hand our children a bright future. And I don't think that people 66 years like me who have been working all this time will give it up now. Not when you saw, some of you caught sight of my little Evie Rose. That's who I work for. So we're going to get our heels nipped by the young people who deservedly recognize we're going too slow. And I'm going to be part of those people nipping at everybody else's heels as fast as I can.
Well, we're glad you are. Bill, final word?
I think Gina's right that we're going too slow. The reality, I think, is that the future has to involve a fundamental transformation of the culture. It's got to affect transportation and agriculture and commodities and electric power and plastics. It's got to be very, very broadly based. It has to command the support of people in the society up and down. It was said apropos of the first Earth Day that if you weren't in favor of the environment, you kept it to yourself. We'd like to get, I think, the same kind of sense in the country, and are going to have to do that if we're really going to transform all of the kinds of enterprises, all of the sectors of the society that we really do have to transform.
Right, thank you. Thanks to all of you for not only for being part of this panel, but for all you've done on behalf of clean air and the environment. We have a big sweep of history here, and we really appreciate you joining us to give your perspectives. So thank you very much.
Thanks to AU
Dan,
and the
you're
American
great.
Lung
Thank you.
Association.
Thank you.
Really a great program, Dan. Thank you. You guys are performing a terrific public service.
Well, great. That's what we're working for. Thank you. So I'm just going to make a few closing comments and then some thank yous, and we will conclude. So I just pulled out some points that I thought there were a lot of terrific points that were made today, but some things that I thought were just worth reiterating briefly at the end. There was a lot of attention to localized problems, that we have a national structure. There's certainly lots of work to do on that and things to do. But often it's a matter of tailoring to very local situations, freight corridors and ports and so on. So that's something that deserves attention. And that can happen at a state and local level. It probably should, but certainly the federal government can be more engaged in supporting that. A lot of discussion about frontline communities and disproportionate impacts. And we touched upon that in our final session. And that clearly is an area that requires a lot of attention. Some good thoughts on innovation. That government plays private sector does most of the innovating, yes, but government has to develop the incentives and sort of provide the push that makes the innovation occur. Some good thoughts about how the United States should be a leader in clean technology, clean energy, all the other issues that we talked about today. And then some good discussion, I thought, on monitoring capabilities, that we looked at global monitoring, but we also had comments about monitoring at a much more specific community level. And that's going to be really important in solving disproportionate impact kinds of issues, environmental justice kinds of issues. So we started with the promise of the Clean Air Act, moved to innovation for cleaner air and clean air and climate change, and then ended with big lessons from the last 50 years. Many of us, it's come up a lot today, Clean Air Act is probably the most important public health law in American history. I think it's one of the biggest domestic policy laws, second half of the last century. And I think we understand why. There was a commitment to cleaner air. There was broad agreement on its importance. And there are provisions that people like Tom and Leon Billings put in the law that made things happen, push the edge. Science is important, understanding health issues, understanding that vehicles are an important part of the problem, attributing different kinds of health effects to different kinds of pollutants, and always pushing ahead to apply those lessons through the more stringent ambient air quality standards and constantly pressing the envelope on technology. I think that's been important. Most important, though, was the sense of common purpose, a commitment to the greater good. I think that's what is reflected in the Clean Air Act. And we know we have the science, we have the technology, we have the kind of legal and administrative leadership to do this thing. So we hope that that commitment to the common good and to overcoming these kinds of barriers and to recognizing that health and well-being across the board are very important. So let me conclude with some thank yous. First, to all of our speakers today. Not only for your efforts today, but all your work on behalf of clean air and a better environment. To our friends at the American Lung Association, they do extremely important work. Certainly had lots of evidence of that today. And they're really good at it. It's been a real pleasure to work with the American Lung Association on this project, and to all of our other partners. Lots of people contributed to this program, but let me reiterate what Paul said in the opening. Two people really did all the day-to-day lifting that made this program come together. Diana Van Vliet of the American Lung Association, Danielle Miller-Wagner of the School of Public Affairs at American University. So special thanks to them. And finally, thanks to everybody that joined us today for this discussion. You are all part of the search for clean air, and there's a lot of work to do. A lot has been accomplished, but much more to be done. Please join us on October 14th for a follow-up event as part of this program, a conversation with Mary Nichols, chair of the California Air Resources Board. And we've heard a lot about California's leadership and innovation. And so here's a chance to pursue that. So I hope to see you on the 14th. Until then, good evening.